Imagine spending 2 years building the most powerful engine in American racing history. You test it, you tune it, you watch it destroy every record on the drag strip. Crowds go insane when you pull into the staging lanes. Teams are terrified of you. You are untouchable. And then, one morning, a letter arrives. No hearing, no appeal, no real explanation, just 2 words: you're banned. That happened 5 times in NHRA history. 5 engines so dominant, so threatening, so far ahead of their time, that the most powerful drag racing organization in America had only one answer for them: erase them. And behind every single ban is a story involving politics, money, and manufacturers using the rulebook as a weapon against each other. Today, we count them all down, and by number 1, you will question everything you thought you knew about fair competition in American motorsport. Let's go. Welcome back. This channel exists to tell the stories the official record tries to bury, the cars that were too fast, the engines that were too good, the moments that embarrassed the wrong people. Today we're not talking about the cars, we're talking about their hearts. 5 engines that were so threatening that the rulebook itself had to be rewritten to stop them. 5 engines, 5 bans, 5 stories that should have ended differently, starting with number 5, the 426 Race Hemi, 1964-1965. It's 1963 in America, and the auto industry is at war. Ford is winning NASCAR, Chrysler is furious, and the boardrooms in Detroit are angrier than the drivers on the track. Chrysler's engineers are handed one mission: build something that destroys everything Ford has, whatever it takes. What they built became one of the most legendary engines in American history. The 426 cubic inch V8 with hemispherical combustion chambers. And right from the beginning, competitors gave it a nickname that told you everything about facing it. They called it the Elephant. The hemispherical combustion chamber design was the key. Rounded, dome-shaped chambers allowed massive intake and exhaust valves to sit opposite each other, with the spark plug dead center. The result was airflow so dramatically better than anything else on the market that it wasn't an incremental improvement. It was a generational leap. In race trim, official numbers said over 400 horsepower. The people who actually built these engines privately said those numbers were laughably conservative. February 1964. The Daytona 500. Plymouth lines up Hemi-powered Belvederes. The race starts, and the Plymouths walk away from the field immediately. By the time it's over, Plymouth has finished first, second, and third. First race the Hemi ever entered in NASCAR competition. Complete sweep. Ford executives are making phone calls before the checkered flag drops. At the NHRA Nationals that same year, Roger Lindemood drives a Hemi Dodge to a Superstock class victory. The competition has no answer. Teams running conventional wedge-head engines are in a completely different performance category, and every race weekend, the Hemi teams keep learning the engine, keep finding more power, keep pulling further ahead. Then the ban arrives. For the 1965 season, NASCAR rules out what they call special racing engines. Engines not available to the general public. Official reason: stock car racing should feature stock cars. Real reason: the Elephant was winning everything, and someone decided that needed to stop. Chrysler's response is legendary. They look at the ban announcement, look at their racing program, and walk away from NASCAR entirely. No Dodge, no Plymouth, no Hemi. They refuse to race under rules they consider unfair, and they're not quiet about why. Meanwhile, at NHRA, the weight penalties start appearing, the class adjustments, the technical interpretations that consistently work against the Hemi teams. The message is unmistakable even when the rulebook language is careful. The Elephant is being caged. Here's what makes this painful. Chrysler's engineers in 1964 had not finished developing the Race Hemi. They were still at the starting point of what this engine could do. More displacement was possible. Better cylinder heads were in development. Fuel system advances were being explored. A fully developed, unrestricted Hemi program could have dominated through the end of the decade. Instead, they spent the next several years fighting the rulebook instead of fighting the competition. And every year, they fought the rulebook. Everyone else got closer, not because they built a better engine, but because the rules kept closing the gap artificially. The Elephant was magnificent, and it never got to show its full potential. But as dominant as the Race Hemi was, number 4 arrived from a completely different direction. Ford had been humiliated at Daytona, and their answer was so radical, so far ahead of conventional American engineering that it got banned before it completed a single official lap. The Ford 427, SOHC Cammer, 1964-1967. Henry Ford II did not take the Daytona humiliation quietly. He walked into his engineering department and made his expectations clear. I need something that doesn't just compete with the Hemi. I need something that destroys it. His engineers had a plan. They took Ford's proven 427 cubic inch FE block and transformed it into something America had never seen on a drag strip. Instead of the conventional pushrod valve train that every American racing engine used, they converted it to a single overhead cam design, one camshaft per bank of cylinders, sitting directly on top of the cylinder heads, driven by a timing chain, nearly 6 feet long. They added hemispherical combustion chambers, revised the entire oiling system, added cross-bolted main bearing caps to handle dramatically higher RPM. The result produced around 600 horsepower on gasoline, a number that had never been achieved by any American production-based V8 engine in history. Inside Ford's engineering department, they called it the 90-day wonder, because that is genuinely how long it took to build from concept to a running engine. 90 days to create something that produced more power than anything Detroit had ever seen. Ford submitted the 427 SOHC to NASCAR for approval ahead of 1965. They were confident. The engine was technically sound, based on an existing block, and represented exactly the innovation a serious racing series should welcome. NASCAR's Bill France said no. His stated reason: the overhead can design was too European for American stock car racing. The real reason, according to most historians of the era, was simpler and more uncomfortable. The Cammer would have made every other engine in NASCAR immediately and permanently obsolete. No other manufacturer had anything close to this technology ready to race. It was the first time in NASCAR history that an engine had ever been banned. Not penalized, not restricted, banned completely, before it completed a single lap. Ford turned to NHRA's factory experimental class, where advanced technology had always been more welcome. Factory-backed Mustangs and Mercury Comets arrived at events with Cammer engines installed and Ford engineers in the trailer. The results were immediate. Bill Lawton won the NHRA Winter Nationals experimental class in a Cammer Mustang. Dyno Don Nicholson was running deep into the 9-second range in his Cammer Comet. A Cammer-powered car became the first in NHRA history to officially reach 200 miles per hour. 200 miles per hour. In 1965. An engine built in 90 days on a modest budget. Ford lobbied NASCAR hard through 1965 and into 1966. In December 1965, NASCAR reinforced the ban rather than lifting it. In 1966, they offered a compromise. The Cammer could race, but only in full-size Galaxies with one small carburetor carrying 430 extra pounds. Against Hemi cars running without those restrictions, Ford walked away from NASCAR entirely. Just like Chrysler had done the year before, teams continued running the Cammer in NHRA's factory experimental class for several more seasons. Modified versions reportedly produced figures that would seem extraordinary even by modern standards. And then gradually the class structures that had accommodated the Cammer were reorganized, the rules shifted, and the era ended. Connie Kalitta, who drove Cammer-powered cars in their prime and went on to build one of the most successful top fuel operations in NHRA history, has said a modernized Cammer design would make a phenomenal top fuel engine even today. That's not nostalgia. That's a man with decades of engineering experience saying the fundamental design was so sound it remains relevant 60 years later. Approximately 500 Cammers were ever built. An unmodified factory spec example today is one of the rarest pieces of American motorsport hardware in existence. The engine that never got to show what it could really do, sitting behind glass while everyone wonders what might have been. The Hemi was banned once and kept coming back. The Cammer was banned before it started. Number 3 is the story of what happens when a manufacturer brings its banned engine into a brand new class, wins everything, and watches the rulebook get rearranged to stop them all over again. The 426 Race Hemi in Pro Stock, 1970-1972. By 1970, NHRA had launched a new class called Pro Stock. The concept was compelling. Cars that looked like something a fan could buy at a dealership, maximum legal modifications, pure engineering and driver skill. The rulebook was being written in real time, and Chrysler saw an opening. The factory-backed program arrived with some of the most talented drag racers alive. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin, two of the most respected names in the sport, were running Hemi-powered Plymouth Barracudas and Dodge Darts. These weren't just fast cars. They were driven by people who had spent years understanding exactly what the Hemi wanted and exactly how to give it to them. What followed wasn't really a competition. It was a Chrysler exhibition with occasional appearances from other manufacturers. Event after event through 1970 and 1971, the finals featured Mopar against Mopar, Sox and Martin against another Chrysler entry. The Ford and Chevrolet teams weren't racing for the win. They were racing for survival into later rounds, and they knew it. Chrysler won back-to-back Pro Stock World Championships. The numbers they were running were so far ahead of everyone else that opponents were essentially conceding before they staged. What made this more remarkable? The Hemi teams were still developing. The engineers said they hadn't reached the ceiling. There was more power available, more refinement possible, which meant the gap between Chrysler and everyone else wasn't going to close. It was going to widen. NHRA's response was more sophisticated than an outright ban this time. Starting in 1972, they restructured the weight-to-cubic-inch ratios in ways that specifically disadvantaged large displacement Hemi cars. Chrysler teams suddenly found themselves carrying significant extra weight compared to their competitors. The years of engineering advantage, the development, the parts knowledge, the driver expertise was being legislatively canceled pound by pound. Chrysler fought back with smaller displacement, Hemi variants, and more aerodynamic body styles. Nothing worked. By the mid-70s, lighter small-block Chevrolets and Pintos in Vegas had a structural rules advantage that no amount of Hemi development could overcome. The 426 Hemi earned a distinction no other engine in American motorsport history can claim, specifically penalized by both NASCAR and NHRA in different eras, in different contexts, for different stated reasons. And each time, the engine's actual performance had given its competitors no legitimate answer other than to change the rules. The elephant was magnificent twice, and twice it was stopped by a pen rather than a faster engine. Now the list gets strange. Number 2 didn't come from an American manufacturer. It wasn't a V8. It came from Japan, and it didn't just beat the competition. It broke the entire NHRA classification system so completely that the organization spent years failing to handle it. And when they finally ran out of options, they did something so quietly unprecedented that most fans have never heard the story. Number 2. Terry Hoard's 4-rotor Mazda Wankel engine, 1979-1981. What if I told you the engine that gave NHRA the worst headaches in the late 1970s wasn't American at all? It wasn't a Hemi, it wasn't a Ford. It was a tiny rotary engine from Japan, inside a little Mazda RX-3, driven by a man named Terry Hoard. And NHRA had absolutely no idea what to do with it. The Wankel rotary works completely differently from every engine we've discussed today. Instead of pistons moving up and down, it uses triangular rotors spinning inside an oval-shaped housing, creating 3 combustion chambers that fire in sequence. It produces power in a remarkably smooth, high-revving way, and it is genuinely difficult to compare to a conventional piston engine on a displacement basis, because the way it generates power is fundamentally different in ways that make direct cubic-inch comparisons meaningless. Terry Hoard understood this better than anyone. He built a 4-rotor version of the Mazda Wankel, installed it in a lightweight RX-3 he named the Samurai Warrior, and arrived at NHRA modified eliminator events in the late 1970s, a class designed for smaller import-based 4-cylinder cars. On paper, his car had no business competing with anything serious. In reality, he was running over a full second quicker than the class index. NHRA moved him to a higher class. He dominated there too. They moved him again. He won again. By 1980, NHRA officials were openly admitting they had no valid method to classify a Wankel rotary engine against conventional piston engines. Their displacement equivalency formulas, the ones they used for everything else, simply didn't translate to a rotary design. So they tried loading his car with hundreds of pounds of ballast weight to slow him down. He still won. They moved him into a class where he'd face the best turbocharged four-cylinders in the country and stripped away his supercharger to equalize things. The most dangerous turbo car in that class was Buddy Ingersoll's Turbo Pinto, which had been beating everyone for years. Terry Hoard's naturally aspirated four-rotor Mazda beat it anyway. At the end of 1981, NHRA dissolved Modified Eliminator entirely and reorganized the categories. When the new classification systems were written, there was no provision for Wankel rotary engines, no displacement equivalency formula, no weight index, no class. The combination wasn't in the rulebook, which meant it couldn't legally compete. No press release, no announcement, no explanation, just a new rulebook with the rotary engine simply absent from it. Drag racing historian Brett Kepner documented what happened with a conclusion that has stayed with enthusiasts ever since. NHRA was so exhausted by years of failing to fairly handle Terry Hoard's Mazda that they took the only option they had left. They wrote the combination out of existence. To this day, no one in NHRA has developed a workable method to classify Wankel rotary engines in conventional drag racing competition. The problem Terry Hoard created in 1979 was never solved. It was made irrelevant by removing the car from the equation. Think about what he actually proved. A Japanese rotary engine, in the hands of a skilled driver, could outrun everything America's drag racing tradition had to offer, turbocharged, supercharged, or naturally aspirated. And the response wasn't to develop a fair classification system. The response was to make sure nobody ever saw it happen again. The samurai warrior earned its name, and then the sport pretended it never existed. One engine left. And everything on this list, the political bans, the weight penalties, the classification games, all of it comes together in one final story. The story of an engine so perfectly matched to its car, so devastatingly effective, that it didn't just end its own era of competition. It ended the entire concept of the factory lightweight drag car, forever. Number 1. The 426 Race Hemi in the 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart LO2380 cars. Remember that number. Not 80,000, not 800. 80 individual vehicles, built for one specific purpose. Go to the drag strip, line up, and win. The story of how these 80 cars came to exist is itself a story about engineering ambition, corporate politics, and people who refused to accept that their best ideas weren't allowed. The Dodge Dart was a compact car, sensible, practical, family transportation, and Chrysler Corporation had an internal rule that prohibited Dodge from factory installing the 426 Hemi into compact cars, the reasoning being partly about protecting the premium pricing of larger Hemi-equipped models. If a Dart could get a Hemi, what justified the price premium on a Charger? Dodge's racing department didn't care about the corporate reasoning. They cared about one thing: the combination of the 426 Race Hemi's power and the Dart's lightweight compact body was so obviously devastating on the drag strip that they had to make it happen. Their solution was creative in the way racing solutions often are. Dodge would build the Darts to a point, body structure complete, interior fitted, transmission in place. Then, they'd ship the cars without engines, without hoods, without front fenders, to Hurst Performance in Michigan. Hurst would install the 426 Race Hemi, fit the fiberglass hood with its aggressive functional scoop, hang the fiberglass front fenders, and deliver the completed cars as Hurst products rather than factory Dodge products. Whether this fiction held up entirely is something historians still debate. People who worked in Dodge's racing department have privately said the Hemis were actually installed at the factory before the cars went to Hurst. What is not debated is that 80 Dodge Darts received Race Hemi engines through this process, and every single one was built specifically for NHRA Superstock competition. The build process was obsessive about weight reduction. Fiberglass fenders, fiberglass hood, door panels, acid dipped to remove steel from the inside. Thinner window glass, window mechanisms eliminated entirely, sound insulation gone, every decorative piece gone, special K-member to locate the Hemi properly. Heavy-duty suspension tuned specifically for drag strip weight transfer. Limited slip differential so both rear tires work together at maximum. The 426 Race Hemi, officially rated at 425 horsepower. Everyone who worked on these cars knew that was a polite fiction. In full race preparation with properly tuned carburation and headers, actual output was closer to 500 horsepower in a car weighing somewhere around 30 pounds ready to race. The class records suggested mid-11-second quarter miles. Developed Hemi Dart teams were running mid-10s. When the Hemi Darts arrived at 1968 NHRA events, the season told the same story every single weekend. Dick Landy, one of Chrysler's primary factory-supported racers, was dominating Superstock. At event after event, the finals featured a Hemi Dart against a Hemi Barracuda. Chrysler versus Chrysler. Ford and Chevrolet teams watched from earlier in the bracket, not because they were making mistakes, but because they were simply not in the same performance category. The 1968 NHRA U.S. Nationals, the most prestigious regular season event in drag racing, was won by Arlen Venke in a Plymouth Hemi Barracuda. The Superstock Eliminator Final had a Hemi car in both lanes. For the entire season, it was almost always a Mopar in both staging beams when the final round lights came on. NHRA reached for the same tool they always used: weight penalties. The rulebook was adjusted to require Hemi-equipped Superstock cars to carry additional ballast, making them heavier, disrupting the weight distribution teams had carefully developed over years, canceling the mechanical advantage through legislation rather than competition. The weight penalties worked in the sense that they slowed the Hemi cars relative to the competition, but they created a consequence NHRA may not have fully anticipated. They proved, clearly and publicly, that the entire concept of the factory lightweight drag car had been made pointless. If the whole purpose of stripping weight was to gain a competitive advantage, and NHRA would simply require that weight to be added back whenever the advantage became too visible, then what was the point of stripping it at all? Chrysler looked at the new requirements and made a decision. The Hemi Dart program ended. No 1969 successor, no continuation. The era of factory-built, purpose-made Superstock drag cars from Detroit's major manufacturers closed without ceremony. There has never been another program like it. No manufacturer has shipped purpose-built Superstock drag racers directly from a factory to customers the way the Hemi Dart program did. The concept was tried once, perfected immediately, dominated completely, stopped by the rulebook, and quietly retired because the rules had made it unworkable. The 426 Race Hemi appears on this list 3 times, in its original form, in Pro Stock, and in the Hemi Dart. That alone tells you what this engine was. But the Hemi Dart earns number 1 for one specific reason. It wasn't just the most dominant application of a banned engine. It was the application that permanently changed what factory involvement in drag racing even meant. That ended an era and proved, more clearly than anything else on this list, how far a sanctioning body would go to prevent one manufacturer's engineering from becoming too dominant. The 426 Race Hemi holds a distinction no other engine in American motorsport can claim. Specifically banned, restricted, or penalized by both NASCAR and NHRA in multiple separate contexts across multiple decades. Every single time it was magnificent. The response from the people running the sport was to change the rules. The greatest drag racing engine America ever produced. Banned repeatedly, because nobody could beat it any other way. 5 engines, 5 bans. 5 different ways a sanctioning body looked at something extraordinary and decided the right answer was to make it disappear. The 426 Race Hemi, banned in NASCAR before it could run a second season, penalized in NHRA until it couldn't compete, stopped in Pro Stock with rules that never applied equally to its competitors. The 427 Cammer built in 90 days, producing impossible power, banned before it turned an official NASCAR lap, eventually written out of the drag racing classes where it had finally found a home. The Hemi Dart. 80 cars. 1 perfect season. The end of an entire category of factory drag racing. Terry Hoard's Mazda. So far outside everything, NHRA understood that they spent years failing to classify it and finally chose the simplest solution. Delete the class. Pretend the problem never existed. Every one of these stories raises the same question. When a governing body changes the rules to slow down the fastest car, is that protecting fair competition, or is it protecting the competitors who couldn't figure out how to build a faster car? The fans who showed up to watch drag racing in 1964, in 1968, in 1971, they deserve to see the fastest cars run as fast as they could go. They deserve to see the 426 Hemi run unrestricted until someone built something better. They deserve to see the Cammer go head-to-head with the Hemi and find out which engineering philosophy actually won. They were denied that. We were all denied that. Drop your answer in the comments. Which of these bans do you think was the most unjust? Which engine do you believe was robbed the worst? And if you could go back to one single season of NHRA drag racing and watch one of these banned combinations run completely freely, which one would it be? Subscribe if you haven't already. Because next time, we're going even further, to cars that didn't just get banned from NHRA, they got banned from American motorsport entirely. And the story of why is even more political, even more controversial, and even more infuriating than anything we covered today. See you there.